During this hour, we've had a focus on Asia, with particular attention being paid to the cost of carbon in the form of human displacement. We saw some amazing and compelling videos, and if you look around Asia, you see the impacts of floods and droughts and storms. And just this year in India, the storms caused massive flooding in New Delhi, and not just in the region that was covered by the video. In China, Sichuan province had amazing destructive floods with some dramatic rescues that went all through the day and into the night. We're seeing rescues like this in places around the world. We saw one earlier in Brazil, we've seen it in India, and here it is in Sichuan province just a few months ago this past summer. This too is part of the cost of carbon. We're seeing this kind of flooding throughout the most populated part of our world, that is throughout Asia. Here is another province in China rescuing a little baby. The impact throughout this region has been quite severe. This is all just in the past, well, this is this month. In Zhejiang province. This is a little bit earlier, a few years ago. You see the scale of some of these disasters and the recovery operations. This one displaced 8.5 million people. Heavy rains in 13 provinces in China. This was in the city of Beijing last year. Incredible downpour and massive devastation. The rescues of families. This is in Taiwan, where a downpour caused an amazing tragedy. This year also, this month in the Philippines. The Philippines have been particularly hard hit. 50,000 people displaced by this particular storm. This is the emergency room of a hospital in Valenzuela City in the Philippines. This was a couple of years ago, and it's easy to forget that when these urban areas flood, the water brings a lot of debris and a lot of nasty stuff with it. The agricultural damage is sometimes overlooked. This storm last year in the Philippines caused $210 million in crop damage. This super typhoon was the strongest and most intense storm ever to make landfall. And the Philippines has set some records where these climate-related disasters are concerned. But of course, the downpour that probably captured most world attention was in Pakistan 3 years ago, when 20 million people were displaced by a massive flood with biblical scenes of destruction caused by the flood waters and the massive relocation of all these many millions of people. In Japan, just 3 months ago, a series of large downpours created flooding events there. Over the last couple of years in both South Korea and North Korea, this mudslide reached the 4th floor of this apartment building. North Korea was also hit by flooding this was last year. They're kind of isolated, of course, but the news comes out, and both North and South Korea suffered the worst drought that either country had ever suffered since records have been kept over the last 100 years. And of course, in India, there have been repeated climate-related intensified droughts. This was Yunnan province earlier this year. Guizhou province, over 1 million people affected as this drought goes into its 4th consecutive year. These are not isolated droughts. Look at the red area on this map of China with severe drought and extreme drought. This covers a massive proportion of China. This has been really causing a tremendous amount of economic damage, and again, it's part of the cost of carbon. Desertification. Many thousands, tens of thousands of villages have had to be relocated in China because of the advancing deserts. Now, today in China, I mentioned in the conversation a few hours ago with Dr. Jim Kim at the World Bank. A city of 11 million people, Harbin, has been shut down. The schools are closed, the institutions, the public institutions are closed. China is suffering from the effects of conventional air pollution in the same processes that cause global warming pollution. People can't even see who they're walking with. This is one of the reasons why last month China announced that they're going to ban any new coal-fired plants in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. China has also launched a pilot cap and trade program in 5 cities and 2 provinces, and they've announced that these pilots will serve as the model for a nationwide rollout within the next 2 years. That's encouraging. A lot of countries, well, this is a statement from the president of China, who took over last March, that every country has to deal with this. A lot of countries now have carbon policies, and China's could be very impressive. The remaining big question mark is whether or not the United States will adopt a nationwide policy. So we heard in this past hour about the displacement of people by sea level rise. Many know the story of the Maldives, where they had a cabinet meeting in scuba gear underwater. Their whole country may disappear, and the international lawyers are saying, well, what do we do? No country's ever physically disappeared, but a bunch of them are now threatened with that because the sea level rise is coming in the future mostly from the land-based ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, mostly West Antarctica, although there are many areas of East Antarctica as well. The cities that are most at risk from sea level rise in terms of population, Calcutta's first, Mumbai, Dhaka, etc. If you measure the cities at risk from sea level rise by the assets at risk, many are surprised that Miami in the United States is number 1 on the list, and then number 3 after Guangzhou is New York and Newark, and you can see the rest of them there. This is part of the cost of carbon. Do we just accept that, or do we put a price on carbon and start avoiding the emissions that are driving the cost of carbon up in the form of sea level rise and refugees, humans displaced, drought, floods, storm damage, and all of these other costs of carbon? We need to put a price on carbon in markets, and we need to put a price on denial in political systems. This is the way forward. And luckily, a lot of the countries in Asia are beginning to choose this path. India plans to quadruple renewable energy generation within the next 9 years. Already we have seen dramatic progress in China with offshore wind and onshore wind. They're really leading the world in the installation of windmills and solar panels. Japan is also making a major commitment to both wind and solar, particularly in the wake of the Fukushima disaster, which was such a tragedy. They are really doubling down. China is also really investing heavily in solar. The Philippines is playing a leadership role in solar and wind. Solar parity has already been reached in India. But let's look at this for a second. You know, 10 years ago, or 13 years ago, there was a projection on how quickly wind energy would increase in world markets. The reality 13 years later is that we exceeded that prediction 7 times over. Then there was a prediction on what China, the largest country in the world, and Asia would do in wind. That prediction was exceeded 22 times over. There was a market projection on what the world would build in the form of solar energy just 11 years ago. Well, how correct was the projection? It's been exceeded by 17 times. Now, what does this remind you of? What it reminds me of is what happened when the market predictions were made for the expansion of cell telephone use. They projected 900,000 users by 2000. It was exceeded by 120 times. Why? Well, because the cost came down as the quality went up, and the decisions to buy were made by individuals, and developing countries leapfrogged the old technology. Now that's what's happening with solar energy. All of the developed countries and China, but one of the biggest increases is in the rest of the world. We need to put a price on carbon and save the future.